Good morning. Today we're working on an activity that's all about learning about a man named Gregor Mendel who bred pea plants to see how traits were passed on from one generation to the next. Gregor Mendel is often called the father of genetics, so he's a really important person to the study of genetics. For today's activity, you're going to be working on an assignment called Gregor Mendel and Genetics. So if you go to Google Classroom, you'll find this link, and this is what our document will look like today. You can see there's a website we'll be using to complete this activity. So you can either click on this link here and go to the website DNA from the beginning, or you'll find the link to that in Google Classroom as well. By the end of this activity, we should understand these three learning targets. We should understand that Gregor Mendel bred pea plants by cross-fertilizing them to study the inheritance of traits. We should understand that different combinations of alleles result in different genotypes, and different genotypes are expressed as different phenotypes. And we should also be able to use Punnett squares that are models that can be used to predict the outcomes for cross-fertilization. So all of these things are going to be covered in our activity today. We see, as we start here, concept number 1, children resemble their parents. And it tells us on the website, we're going to click on the button that says Classical Genetics, and then click on section 1, Children Resemble Their Parents. So I've included this little picture that shows like what we're going to click when we're at the website. So if I'm on the website, I see 3 buttons, and I'm looking for Classical Genetics. So I click on that, and then I want to go here to section 1, Children Resemble Their Parents. So when I choose that, I see that I now have concept 1, and I am able to read the concept. I can also look at the animation for this concept. There is a gallery of pictures for this concept. There's a video. There's all sorts of things here. We're working really only with the concept and the animation. So as I read this, it kind of helps explain the beginning of the study of genetics. So let's go through this first one together. Since the beginning of human history, people have wondered how traits are inherited from one generation to the next. Although children often look more like one parent than the other, most offspring seem to be a blend of the characteristics of both parents. Centuries of breeding of domestic plants and animals had shown that useful traits such as speed in horses, strength in oxen, and larger fruits and crops can be accentuated by controlling mating. However, there was no scientific way to predict the outcome of a cross between 2 particular parents. It wasn't until 1865 that an Augustinian monk named Gregor Mendel found that individual traits are determined by discrete factors, later known as genes, which are inherited from the parents. His rigorous approach transformed agricultural breeding from an art to a science. He started with parents of known genetic background to provide a baseline against which to compare patterns of inheritance in the resulting offspring. Then he carefully counted the numbers of individuals showing the various traits in successive generations of offspring. So we've got a ton of vocabulary here in this passage. We've got the idea of breeding, which we're calling a cross between particular parents. We have this idea of traits, such as speed in horses or strength or the size of fruit. And we also have this idea of generations. So the parents would be one generation, the children would be the next generation, the grandchildren would be the third generation. And the idea of offspring. And offspring is just another word for children. So I've read concept. Let's go back and take a look at what we need to do here. It says, who was Gregor Mendel? All right, so we need to answer this question. And I've answered this one already for us here. Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian monk who was known as the father of genetics. You can see here that I've typed my answer here into the question. I used a different size font and then I highlighted it in yellow. You don't need to do all of that, but it is helpful if you leave some space between the question and your own typing, or perhaps change the font that you're typing with or the color that you're typing with to make what you type stand out from the question. So question 2 says, Mendel felt traits were determined by factors. Today we realize they are inherited from parents. What do we call these factors today? So if you don't remember from the reading, we come back over here and we're looking for that passage that kind of talked about those individual traits being determined by factors. So I find that here in the second paragraph where it says, Gregor Mendel found that individual traits are determined by discrete factors, later known as genes, which are inherited from the parents. So I would go back here and I would type in, and let's change my text size. Those factors are called genes. And let's say I want to make this look a little bit different from my instructions, so I might choose, like when I answer, I'm going to type in blue. Then it asks us to click on the animation for this section. So children resemble their parents. So we'll go over here and click on animation, which was up here at the top. And here's Gregor Mendel. So he chose to work with pea plants because they're easy to grow and they have many traits that distinguish strains of pea plants from each other. And the traits can also easily be tracked from one generation to another because of how quickly pea plants reach maturity. So now that I have read that first slide, I click my next button. I can see that he explains that when left alone, pea flowers self-fertilize. So that means that the male reproductive cells here in the pollen fertilize the female reproductive cells here in this, the stamen, and they create seeds, and those seeds then grow into pea plants identical to their parent. So the stamen is the male sex part that matures first, and it drops pollen inside the immature flower. And the pistil is the female sex part that matures later. Its eggs are fertilized by the pollen that lands on the pistil. So we can see all of those parts here on this mature flower. To cross-fertilize pea plants, he opened up the immature flower and cut off the stamen before they matured and dropped pollen. So now he has a pea plant that only has the female sex part here. As the flower matured, I dusted its pistil with pollen from another plant, and this is cross-fertilization. So here's the other plant, and it's getting pollen from the male sex part here. And so this is like the dad plant, and this is like the mom plant. And you can see he used a paintbrush to just spread that pollen. So in our questions, Our question says, in the space below, explain how he cross-fertilized pea plants. So we might type something like we did before. So I might change my size, I might change my color. So we would write, he took the pollen from one pea plant and dusted it on the female pea plant to cross-fertilize or breed these two plants, something like that. So now we're ready to move on to concept 2, genes come in pairs. So to find that, we go back to our website, and we can see on the side here we have a bar that has lots of different concepts. So all told, there are 14 of them. We are only going 1 through 6. So I would then come over here and click on number 2, genes come in pairs. Again, I start with the concept here. So I would read the concept. It's always helpful to take a look at what question you're trying to answer before you read, so you know what you're looking for. So here we're looking for the sentence where it says purebred plants with yellow seeds produced only blank seeds. So we have to find out what type of seeds those purebred plants produced. So I'll go back to my reading, and rather than looking at the pea plant as a whole, Mendel focused on 7 individual traits that he could readily distinguish. He found that each trait has 2 alternate forms. For example, seed color can be green or yellow. By analyzing the results of various crosses, Mendel concluded that each alternative form of the trait is specified by alternative forms of a gene. So if I pause here and just think about this, peas come in yellow or green. At the grocery store, we only see green peas, but in nature, we find yellow and green peas. So that means that we're selectively choosing these green peas for the peas that make it to the grocery store. So we would need to know the genetics in order to create only green peas to grow and put in our grocery stores. So we're understanding here that we have alternative forms of these traits, and that alternative form must be a different form of that same gene. To follow the inheritance of genes from parents to child, Mendel first needed to be sure which genes each parent carried. Since pea plants are naturally self-fertilizing, purebred strains were readily available. Each strain contained only one form of the gene that determined a trait. Purebred plants with yellow seeds only produced offspring with yellow seeds. So this is what we were looking for to answer our question. Purebred plants with green seeds only produced offspring with green seeds. From the results of further experiments, Mendel reasoned that purebred plants must have 2 copies of the same gene for each trait. So if we take a look at our picture, we can see here we have 2 copies. We represent them with the letter Y, so we have an uppercase Y and a lowercase y, and an uppercase Y and a lowercase y here. In the picture, they're showing pink as like the female and blue as the male, because we need, for a genetic cross, we need both male and female in order to produce offspring. So I'll come back over here, and my instructions are to type the answer into this box. So I'm gonna make this my answer box. So purebred plants with yellow seeds only produce yellow